Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to the second video in my raid retrospective series. This is where we look back at Final Fantasy XIV's older raids to see what they were doing with the bosses back then, see if there's lessons that we can learn and maybe reiterate on nowadays, or maybe just find some things that should be stuck back in the old ways of Final Fantasy XIV. In the first video, we looked at the binding coil of Bahamut and pointed out its ups and downs, but now we're going to be going to a much more popular raid tier in that of the second coil of Bahamut. This is what many consider a marvelous triumph in design over the first coils of Bahamut, but that doesn't mean that it was absolutely perfect. So much so that there's even a savage difficulty of this version. And mind you, back then, the normal modes basically were the savage equivalent. So the savage back then was basically 4 individual ultimate fights. We'll only make a few brief comments about the savage encounters because they themselves were full of ups and downs. But we are going to look back on the second coils of Bahamut and judge those encounters, what they did right, what they did wrong, and could we see a return of some of those mechanics in the future. Before we get started, this video has a sponsor, Magic Spoon. It's a high-protein cereal that helps me shake up my daily eating. It can get boring having the same things day in and day out, and because I'm very protein conscious, I always have to be considering it. But Magic Spoon gives me plenty of solid options, not just because they have a ton of cereals with a ton of different flavors, but they also have treat bars and even granola. They all taste great, they hit my cravings where I need to hit them, and they give me the protein that I want, whether that's as breakfast or as a midday snack. If you'd like to try Magic Spoon while also supporting the channel, then click the link below to try some today. Build your own custom box of products with tons of available flavors to match your daily needs or wants. Best of all, use my link and discount code Mr. Happy to get $5 off your box. You can also buy it at your local grocery store if you'd prefer, or even on Amazon. And if you don't like it, Magic Spoon has a 100% happiness guarantee. Let them know and they'll refund you. No questions asked. So click the link below or scan the QR code on the screen and use code Mr. Happy to get $5 off, or go to magicspoon.com/Mr. Happy to save $5 on your order. It even works in Canada and the UK. Thanks to Magic Spoon for sponsoring, and now back to the video. Now, we're not going to be talking about the trash because that was something that we just had back then that we don't have now. And quite frankly, I don't think they're going to go back to doing trash in raids as much as some of you may want them. They'll stick to places like the Fork Tower in exploration content, or maybe other styles of content actually having trash. But in our 8-player raids, we are going to be focusing solely on the bosses. First up, we have turn 6, or second coil turn 1, in that of Rafflesia. Now, in some ways, this boss is a big evolution over Caduceus, the first boss in the binding coil of Bahamut. There is some buff and debuff management, as well as adds that need to be handled in a very particular way. It definitely feels like a matter of applying lessons learned, and for the most part, conceptually at least, they do a pretty good job of it, with a few problems that sprout out across the entirety of the second coils of Bahamut. Now, in Phase 1, players are tethered to one another by vines that can be broken with distance. This mechanic I don't need to explain to you. It would become a mainstay for the entire decade after the second coil's release, and fights would gradually use them in more and more ways. That being said, I do think there's some lessons to be learned about how these vines were actually used back in the second coil. While you can somewhat predict and handle the possibilities of who will be tethered to who, they're far less static than the current way it's used in most mechanics, where a DPS and a support are normally tethered together, which results in just the entire party stacking up and running to designated spots. You could kind of do it there, but there's all sorts of different patterns here. 2 players being tethered to each other, 2 sets of 2 players being tethered to each other, 1 player being tethered to 2 other players, 1 person being tethered to 2 players who's then each tethered to another player, and 1 player being tethered to 4 separate players, all of which have their own ways of handling them in each of the mechanics. They do come at set times, so you know which vine pattern is coming, but it means that you couldn't just say, hey, this person goes here, that person goes there. There had to be a little bit more thinking and a lot more of what we used back then called body language. Body language methods of handling mechanics is something that players with the skill set will utilize for certain mechanics, even in the current day. And it's common to see when people are just doing week 1 clears of Savage, especially through the first few encounters, where people often limp through those encounters without having, picture perfect strategies. We often see players who struggle with body language struggle through things like the bridges in Queen Eternal. That's a good example of a fight where we line things up and then we have to do it with body language afterwards, but a lot of players struggle with that because there's no set rule based on who gets what. You just have to be able to look around you. And this was a great fight to get players to showcase that body language skill, and players who could or couldn't do it were incredibly obvious. The boss also summoned bulbs in many different possible configurations. Instead of focusing on set types of spawns that it could do, instead there's basically like 8 different locations that a bulb could spawn, and anytime bulbs did spawn, 3 of them would spawn in 3 of those 8 locations. They could be all 3 next to each other, they could form a triangle, you could have 1 in the middle, 2 on the outside. There was all sorts of different patterns you could do, and you kind of just had to react to whatever bulb patterns you actually got. Now in normal mode, you could actually just kill the center bulb, which resulted in not really a cheese, but it kind of makes the entire mechanic a kind of a null thing to even consider. You really just end up killing the center one and keeping the boss facing away, and the considerations of which bulbs go where don't really matter. But we will come back to this later when we actually talk about the Savage difficulty. The boss also marks players every other bulb with a suction AoE and eats everyone in front of it after pulling those players in. The vine puddles can be used to prevent the suction, which avoids players being eaten altogether. Any player eaten permanently buffs the boss's damage, which greatly affects the room-wide AoE and all the other damage that follows. The player can somewhat control the direction the boss ejects them as well, which is important because Rafflesia cleaves them right after. Now this suction attack, in essence, should have been a really identifying part of Rafflesia's encounter. I mean, you have to make sure that you don't have the tank getting pulled in by the suction, and you need to make sure that you leave bulbs open in spots that are convenient, that the rest of the party knows where the bulb player goes, and it can never be 100% consistent. So in week 1, it was a lot of just looking around, understanding the space, what to do. Maybe you'd have to have 2 players go stand in a little bulb puddle together, and there was a lot of reaction that came with this, and it definitely trained certain skills to, look around the arena a little bit more. However, Second Coil was a raid most notable for exploits, because the bosses were all conceptually cool, but they all had massive design flaws that resulted in strategies that just kind of made their entire gimmicks not really a factor. And I think turn 6 might be, if not the biggest case, the second biggest case, because there is a problem with turn 7 that many of you may remember. The suction attack could actually be dodged by just walking through the boss right as it turned to actually suck in the marked player. So they would stand really close to the center of the boss's hitbox, and as soon as the boss started turning, they would jump through to the other side, get stunned behind the boss, and the boss only eats anything in front of it. So that would completely, again, eliminate the entire mechanic. This was called the line of sight method, and it just made the bulbs matter even less on top of being able to kill the one in the center of the room. So that's already 2 mechanics that have been made in week 1, mind you, completely pointless. So we're not off to a good start, even if conceptually these things are pretty cool. Then phase 2 begins at 70%, which begins with Blighted Bouquet, our first ever stillness mechanic. If you're moving, auto-attacking, performing any action during this, you just blow up. This has become a staple in endgame content even to this day, and it's proven time and time again that sometimes doing nothing is the hardest thing you can ask a player to do. The other more important thing in this phase is the Honey Glaze ability, where Rafflesia will mark a player with Honey Glaze and spawn bees infinitely so long as that player remains inflicted by it. The bees are little micro DPS checks that must be killed while doing some vines and a Blighted Bouquet, and a couple of other boss attacks depending on how long the bee actually survives. But the bee themselves isn't really the main factor of the Honey Glaze mechanic. The Honey Glaze player can only cleanse it by deliberately being eaten by the boss. So if a player got it, whether it was by the suction attack deliberately or by just standing in front of the boss because they weren't even marked for the suction, they just had to get eaten. And if they didn't get eaten, the bees would just keep spawning and spawning, and the boss could continually mark more and more players with Honey Glaze, and then you just get an army of bees coming after you if things are really, really going sideways. Now, again, conceptually, this is kind of cool. But one big thing was that if the debuff isn't cleansed before phase 3 at 40%, then bees will continue to spawn throughout the entirety of the final phase. This begins a trend for all of Second Coil, where you kind of need to time your checks or hold DPS for incredibly long periods of time. Now, I'll be clear, I don't think having percentage-based phase changes is always a bad thing. There are times where it's kind of a cool thing to be able to, probably force speed through a phase by holding buffs or, holding for just 15, 20 seconds just to get something that's a little bit easier to manage with the next phases like boss rotation and stuff. That's fine. It was present in a lot of A Realm Reborn, but what ends up happening in a lot of Second Coil is you end up missing those windows by like 2 or 3 seconds, and it takes like a full minute or longer before you get to the point where it's safe to push the boss again. If you miss getting eaten and then you get a second player who's honey glazed, you got to wait for the next devour no matter what, which is like 40 to 45 seconds. So everyone just kind of stands around and waits, and it's like, yeah, at least there's a way of fixing it, and it's not an instant wipe, which definitely is appreciated, especially compared to some situations that we've had over the years. But I'm not going to sit here and say that that's a fun design decision. You know what I mean? If you're going to do something like that, you need to make it so that it's not so drastic of a timing that you need to wait. So this is definitely something, if they ever go back to percentage-based phase transitions being far more noticeable and far more frequent throughout the boss's entire encounter versus just happening at specific points or with specific fight mechanics entirely, they really need to be careful that we don't end up in a similar situation here. And then another massive problem, phase 3 begins at 40%, and the boss basically stops doing almost everything from the previous phases except putting vines on allies and doing tank busters. That's not really a problem. We do get that a lot even in the modern day, but I'm more often a fan of carrying over mechanics from previous phases so that your like boss knowledge continues to accumulate on top of itself, instead of every phase being like a completely separate set of skills that you need to learn. Even if it's just 1 or 2 things, it's usually okay, but I prefer fights to compound on themselves. That's not even the problem though with the final phase. That's a problem, but that's not even the problem I was going to get into. Second Coil is also full of Zerg down a phase to skip mechanics tropes, and it's probably no more evident than here. On week 1, players would just Zerg the last 40% of Rafflesia's health and ignore the entire final phase. Yeah, week 1, we were skipping the entire final phase. This isn't like skipping the AoEs at the end of M4S. We're talking about a fully fleshed out and functional phase with debuff management, ad management, damage, vines, and vines breaking in specific patterns so that you could do other mechanics. It was actually a really complex and well thought out phase that to this day and age, I think would actually do fairly well as its own phase, even if it be a little bit out there. But we skipped the whole thing. And so that was a big problem with Second Coil as well, is boss health. We're talking about a fight that on week 1 was probably about 6 minutes long. And even if you had to do a round of the mechanics in the final phase, you're probably just looking at 7.5 to 8 minutes at most. So these encounters are really, really short. And this was, again, not an uncommon thing when it came to the early days of Final Fantasy XIV. What you're supposed to do in this phase is bait slime AoEs to spawn around the arena, spread out, they can't be on top of each other, and then 3 slugs will spawn. If a slug eats a slime while it's at full health, it basically just instantly enrages and then wipes everyone. But when the slug gets low on HP, it goes to eat a slime and then consumes it, heals, does a raid-wide AoE, gets stronger, and then you have to kill it before it explodes again. And you have to make sure that all 3 slugs eat all 3 slimes while the boss is doing its own mechanics. It's got a few things going on. It's got tank damage. And it becomes this really big balance of dealing with all the tank damage while you have a tank that's dealing with the slugs, and they can't really help the main tank who's getting beat on the entire time. And if you don't do it fast enough, the slimes gradually stack up a debuff that at enough stacks will basically just kill everyone. So again, it's a really neat way of asking players to control DPS, be aware of the mechanics that are happening around them. That doesn't happen at all on the normal difficulty. One of the big things about this phase is a debuff called Swarm, which propagates 4 stacks on a player, and then when that player stands on a player, it splits the stacks in half, 2 and 2. And then each of those players can stand on another player and split the stacks again to be 1, 1, 1, and 1. And that gives you a debuff when you get hit by it, and the more stacks of that debuff you have, the more damage Swarm deals, so you have to try to like alternate who gets it, so you don't really go above 2 stacks, and even 2 stacks is kind of dangerous. And you're dealing with that while dealing with the slugs, dealing with the raid wides that are coming out, dealing with the boss damage, and there's still vines that come out, and the boss even fires a split damage AoE at a target during vines, so the vine break has to be kind of within like a line AoE, so everyone can get hit by that while taking the ticking vine damage, and there's actually a consistently pulsing raid wide on top of the slimes dealing the stacking rate. Like, this phase is really well done, and you just skip the whole thing. So we'll come back to talking about the phase very briefly. My Savage section at the end won't be that long, but we just have so many massive problems that they didn't understand about fight design back then that just render like 50 to 60% of the difficulty of the fight just removed. And this is not the only fight here where that happens. It's only the first fight. So it doesn't get worse from here. I think maybe the next fight is arguably worse. But it's not a good thing to be known for in terms of... It's way different than skipping like the last 1 or 2 things that happen. We're talking about skipping like 40% of a boss's health by just blasting it down before the slime debuff kills you. So, yeah. Cool fight when it's done properly. And again, we'll come back to that later. But there's a lot of things they definitely don't want to replicate from Second Coil that are already evident from this one. Now, turn 7 against Melusine is probably the most infamously hated boss. Not only does it have a nauseating elevator ride before you even get to the boss, but it's kind of a boss that's equal parts frustratingly difficult and agonizingly easy, like boringly easy. It's very strange. So the boss has like a tail slap and shoots fireballs at 2 range targets repeatedly. It also has a point blank AoE, but that's like nothing. That's like trash mobs do that, right? So you don't really care about any of that stuff. You just want to make sure that the tank survives the tail slap and the fireballs don't ever hit like overlapping targets, so you stay spread. Big whoop, right? Her big thing is Cursed Voice. Marks a player, and at the end of the debuff, that player petrifies anyone standing in front of them in like a cone. So they have to face towards the outside of the arena, right? We've had plenty of mechanics like that over the years that originated here, pretty much. However, she then summons these ads called Renauds, which tether to a player who hits them and then slowly chases them. If it ever reaches that player, it just smacks them and kills them and then starts going through everyone else. But you can aim the Cursed Voice at them to petrify them. And this is where this fight's cheese mechanic comes in. So you can infinitely repetrify the same Renaud, which means you could just keep one in the back and never have to actually kite it. But she keeps spawning them. She spawns 2, 3, 4. And after the 4th Renaud, if all 4 Renauds are petrified and on the arena, she stops summoning them altogether. So you just gradually stack all the Renauds as they spawn in roughly the same spot in the back of the room, and then constantly repetrify all 4 of them. And it eliminates like 80% of the difficulty of the fight, because everything else that happens in the fight is so not very interesting that when this mechanic is removed from play, there's just not really much of a fight left. Like, there's some things that happen, but it's really not great, you know? Now, despite that, I do think there are some positives with the Renauds. One, they're susceptible to bind and heavy, which I always encourage the devs do with ads more. I think it's more interesting when we have more control over the more tools that we can actively use that allow you to showcase some form of skill. Obviously, it's not a whole lot to say, oh, I pressed heavy, big whoop, right? But some players get really caught up in the moment. They didn't even think to do that kind of stuff. So if you're the player who kind of knows when the right timing is, you're really on top of it. Binds, same deal. Stuns, like any of the CC, I always really appreciate when we're given the ability to, you know, press those buttons and have them influence the fight. Another thing I really like is the Renaud spawn location is like semi-random. Basically, there's like, I think like 6 or 7 spots around the room they can spawn, all in a circle around the center. And, you know, if it spawns right on top of the boss and people are AoEing, then they'll pull them and instantly die. And the fight's probably over because the Renaud's going to go ballistic after that. And I always like when they kind of, they reward you for understanding the boss's rotation in such a way that you can kind of stop and think about what you're about to do for a second and halt. This is evident in M6, where sometimes players accidentally pull the stingrays because they're not really thinking about the stingrays spawning. They're just thinking about where they are in the rotation, and they're punished for it. You either need to think about the direction you're facing or the timing of the ability coming up and halt for like 1 or 2 seconds. It's not really going to impact you that big. And it'll impact you more dying to the stingrays because you've pulled them both and you just get murdered instantly than if you just took a second to think about the timing of the fight. So I do think those are some lessons you can pull, even if the grand scheme of how the mechanic works kind of falls apart. And we will, again, talk about that when we talk about Savage. Now, phase 2 begins at 80%, and the boss instantly changes their rotation to the new one that they're going to be using for the next phase. And that could be really awkward because you could end up spawning a Renaud and not getting marked with Cursed Voice. And then the next phase starts and Cursed Voice doesn't happen for like quite some time. So you end up in this awkward spot where you have to kite the Renaud around for a really long time. And that's just kind of awkward. It's another one of those weird phase push things. And this was really a big problem with Melusine in particular. And especially when you get to Melusine Savage. It's not fun. to just be like, oh, you know, we pushed like half a second too early and then we didn't get this debuff that we need to stun this thing and now it's just gone. I don't know. Like, that works in some fights, that works in some games, but it just doesn't feel good here because of how long you end up having to wait and how low the boss's health is. Again, means that the more gear you get, the more of a problem that ends up becoming. It actually makes this fight worse and worse. The more gear you have, the more DPS you have. It just, the fight just feels worse the more time that goes on with that. After that, you know, the boss is going to summon 3 Lamia. You got to kill them on a set timer or the next one will spawn. And then you'll have too many ads to deal with and they hit really hard. So that's kind of nice having the little DPS check in the middle of the fight. I'll always approve of that. And then the boss starts putting Curse Shriek on players, which is a raid-wide petrify that you can line of sight by having a Renaud between the marked player and the rest of the party. P8S does this exact same thing. It's even called Curse Shriek there. I think it's present in a couple of other fights as well, but that's a more recent one that has it. And yeah, with the Renauds all stacked in the back, I mean, plenty of place to just stand with Curse Shriek, so just make sure you're paying attention to your debuffs, and it's kind of solved. Like, yeah, the players that are on the other side of the boss need to make sure they're not, like, all the way to the sides. And also, if Melusine or any of her Lamia-type ads get hit by any of the petrifies, they get a permanently stacking damage buff. But that was very rarely a problem, almost never a case for concern, because if it did hit the boss, it was probably because somebody aimed it directly through the middle of the room. And, well, if you get petrified and then hit, you die instantly, just like the Renauds do. So, you had other problems there than the boss getting a damage stack if you shot a petrify through the middle of the room, trust me. And then phase 3 begins at 60%. Same deal, you have to watch the phase push for Curse Shriek. But by this point, all 4 Renauds are in the back of the room, so the timing of the phase doesn't matter at all if you're doing that, like, stacking Renaud thing. Bunch of archers spawn, you got to kill them off, they'll just shoot random players, and then occasionally, like, all snipe one player who just needs, like, spot mitt and spot shields, pretty much. More importantly, there's, like, a poison puddle that spawns in the room, either in the center, the inner ring, or the outer ring. It'll do some damage if you walk over it, but it also explodes after a short time, and if you're standing on it when it explodes, you just die. So it becomes just kind of like a space limiter. It's actually a part of the fight that works pretty well. If all your Renauds are stacked in, like, this between the second and third ring, there's a chance that if you have a bad phase push timing, that a Curse Shriek timer may coincide with the outside ring being covered. But if that happens, you don't care because there's really no DPS check in this fight other than killing the individual ads. And quite frankly, if you're this far into the fight, you've already passed the hardest DPS check in that regard, even if there is one more ad after the archers. And B, it doesn't really happen that often with the most common timing. In fact, I don't think it happens at all. And it's completely resolvable by putting the Renauds a little closer to the middle of the room in the inner ring as opposed to between the inner and outer ring. So there's all sorts of solutions that, again, it doesn't really end up affecting the fight at all. And then at 35%, a Prosector Lamia spawns. Another short DPS check. Has, you know, a Hysteria if you don't kill them fast enough. So it's just everyone starts running around. Like I said, small DPS check. And then also has Petrifaction, which is present in a lot of bosses since this time, where if you're looking at the boss, when it finishes casting, you get petrified. The last boss of Void Arc does Petrifaction, for example. Same exact thing. And then once you kill the Prosector, the main boss, Melusine, now gets the ability to also use Petrifaction. So just one more thing to think about where you're looking. And then she also puts Venomous Tail on a random ally. Needs to be a Sunid, or it just deals raid damage the longer it persists. So you just don't want that to happen, so you just get rid of it. Honestly, again, a lot of decent ideas. I really like the idea of, like, a phase happens, the boss permanently gets something, but you also have a short-term threat that needs to be dealt with in the form of an ad. That exact kind of formula, it doesn't work here because of the way the phases are timed and the way that it's based on the boss's percentage HP, like the percentage push. But that's a good idea. And something that they absolutely can use. I love fights. Remember, I just said with the previous fight, I like when fights compound on themselves and gradually become more and more difficult while still keeping the previous phase mechanics. And this is a perfect example of that. It's just not done very well in this particular case because, once again, it's a completely exploitable fight. But I'll be honest, even if you take the exploitable Renaud thing away, the phase push problem is way more evident than it is even in Rafflesia. Like, yes, Rafflesia, oh, you could have Honey Glaze and you'll have to kill an extra bee. And yeah, that sucks. Like, you might have to kill one bee and then try to push the boss. But if you have enough gear, you honestly don't even care. And, like, that one sucks, but this one's, like, every single phase push, you're sitting there waiting like 20 to 25 seconds, 80%, 60%, 35, and you're just like, oh, just let me just kill the boss. Like, why does it have to have such a negative impact so many times throughout the fight where I'm just punished for doing more DPS? It's probably the fight that, again, gets worse and worse the more gear you have and the more you understand about the fight. So it just didn't age week to week very well, and that sucks because it could have been a really cool fight otherwise. But a lot of lessons to not take away from this. And that's why it's kind of funny, because Second Coil is remembered as a great raid tier, but it was so backwards and busted for the most part that it was only good when we didn't think to do these things and then immediately went downhill. It's kind of like in P7S with the Sleepo strat. That one thing that made the fight redeeming was kind of fun was the debuff dash that you have to do at that like 40% mark. And as soon as the Sleepo strat came out, it was like, oh, well, now the only fun part is dead. And yeah, that's kind of this whole fight in a nutshell. It's kind of this whole tier in a nutshell. Honestly, except for maybe the next fight. So turn 8 is against the Avatar. Pretty cool trash phase. It's like a mini maze with like teleporter jumps and like security checks that you have to try to avoid. If you're really, really good at the timing right as you enter, you can skip getting basically any ads here at all. But it's not a big a deal even if you do. You just got to make sure they're all wiped out and then open the final door to get to the boss. Pretty cool set of trash. But the Avatar is a fight that is very conceptually cool, and its only exploitable mechanic is not one of its most memorable ones. So that makes it so that the things that it is most identified with are preserved and have aged actually quite well. So the Avatar summons towers that gradually charge up and perform a special attack. One's a raid-wide, one summons a Dreadnought ad, and the other places landmines around the field. The players can, choose to take some damage and step into a tower to speed up its charge, which you do have to do several times. It forces you to do that. If two towers charge up at the same rate at the same time, so if they're both going from one charge to two charge at the same time, the boss gets a damage buff. And then if two towers are fully charged at the same time, then the boss just wipes the raid. So you have to do this little like micromanagement bit, and every time you eat a tower, any subsequent towers you take for a period of time after that will deal more damage. So you have to alternate who's taking what, and then the boss applies debuffs to the party so that sometimes you may have a plan like, oh, this person will do the first set of towers, this person will do the second set of towers, blah, blah, blah. But then someone gets marked for a debuff and you're like, oh, that person can't do it anymore. So who's the priority for after that? So you have these like little micro priorities or things that can be done with communication that can fix the problem on the spot for statics that actually just work really well with this specific tower system. It's an idea that's conceptually really cool, is executed really well, and gets even better on the Savage difficulty. It's one of the few Savage changes that we'll talk about that isn't kind of a fix for the fight or isn't as lame as some of the other Savage things that they do here. But it's worth remembering that Savage is, that ultimate difficulty kind of for these fights. So it's going to be funny when we talk about it because it will not seem that way when I describe what they did with the Savage encounters. The rest of the mechanics though in the fight aren't really as impressive. They're not bad. It's managing those towers and the effects that they have. The landmines, you need to make sure that players can take them separately without killing each other and without overlapping because they will knock players around at the same time that they pop them. The raid-wide damage that comes out is also, considerable and has to be timed with one of the other debuffs. And on top of that, you have the ad, which can be stacked with the boss and killed, and also has another mechanic that will come into play. Well, one that the Dreadnought kind of just does a lot of damage, and there's another mechanic the main boss does on the main tank that factors into positioning that's also pretty unique. Yeah, but the rest of the mechanics are really just kind of managing the boss. There's like a tether that a player can bait and pull away from the rest of the group that just does like a basic AoE. There's a stacking missile marker on 2 different players that requires either 2 or 3 people to stand in it. If you remember Aetherochemical Research Facility, the second boss basically turns into a bunch of the Coil bosses. The ballistic missiles that boss uses is what I'm referring to. And then there's also a debuff called Allegan Field, that takes all the damage that a player takes and then multiplies it and deals it back to the raid. We've seen that used in many raids since this, but this was the original Allegan Field. And it's honestly the most important thing to manage once you get later into the fight. That AoE charge tower that goes off or any of the landmine explosions hitting the Allegan Field player is usually very bad. But with a bunch of shields stacked on that player, like a Stone Skin and an Adlo, we didn't really have Spot Mitt back then, so it's really just those 2 things. A lot of the times they could just eat through an attack and be perfectly fine and then just exclude themselves from doing mechanics for a short time. And that was enough. And honestly, like, those things are probably the most exploitable parts of the fight, and they don't really identify the fight that much. Like ballistic missiles, the 2 players can just stack on each other, and then you automatically have 2 people in both of the circles. So if it's just 2 small circles, it's resolved. And if there's any large circles, you just need to make sure 1 extra player is standing in the large circle, which requires a light priority system. Elegant Field, just shield the heck out of the player and exclude them from everything. Yeah, you still need a priority system for that too. Like if they're supposed to do a mechanic and now they can't because they have Elegant Field, then 1 other person just has to take over, but that's really simple to set up. Those are definitely, again, not as impressive about the fight, but when you're trying to do everything at once, it actually has a really nice, successful feel to it when you pull it all off, and then you get past the set of towers and get to move on to the next set of towers. The only other thing that's really worth mentioning is Brainjack. The boss will mind control the main tank, and they'll just start auto-attacking the nearest player. Now, in theory, you would think, oh, that's just a fancy way of doing a tank swap. But we didn't even do that back then. We would literally just have the main tank auto-attack like another player who was really close to them, and then just stand still. I, as the Bard, was often in charge of that. I think I have footage of it even, where I would stand like directly under the boss, behind it, and then the tank would get mind-jacked, and they would just walk a few steps forward to start auto-attacking me, and they would still have the boss facing away, but they'd be auto-attacking me the whole time, so they would just pop cooldowns before they were actually mind-jacked or brain-jacked in the first place. I think that that's actually something they should probably look at doing, but with less exploitable ways of handling it. Like, it'd be nice if maybe... So, one thing that Kefka actually does is he will also mind-control people, but if they auto-attack anyone, they instantly die. I think it'd be interesting if that actually became a tank buster, in a sense, where the tank gets brain jacked, and then they auto attack the nearest player, but they deal like Yan levels of damage. So they become a tank buster for the other tank. I think that's like a semi-interesting way of doing it. And maybe they also move really slowly so the boss can like target both tanks with something. And now tank number 1 has to make sure they're actually kiting tank number 2 in the proper way. The only reason why they probably wouldn't do this is because players would be like, oh, my logs or my 2 minutes don't line up. You know, the things that honestly just plague other parts of the game would be too inhibiting because of it. Even if you gave that tank like a damage buff after they were no longer brain jacked, and then you deliberately designed it to not be in the way of 2-minute buffs on average, but I still think there would be potential problems with, I guess, just the way the players would receive it. But I would like to see them do more fun things for tanks in general. And I think this could be an idea that they could borrow in the future. So that entire idea gets a thumbs up. But that's honestly all there really is to talk about. It's about timing tower explosions, dealing with that ad, the Dreadnought, and just controlling the field. But it's a fight that does that really, really well. And even though we cheesed a lot of things, another thing we cheesed, for example, is that main tank also just provoking the Dreadnought and then killing the Dreadnought on top of the main boss and getting all the extra cleave. It was basically like a non-factor, the Dreadnought. It was just a cooldown check, basically. And you could swap if you needed cooldowns on the different tank, or you could even have the off tank pull the Dreadnought just under the boss. But we would often just have one tank, provoke it, pull aggro on it, and then even if they get brain jacked during this, the bait's already set up in a way that they have both the ad and the boss, and the brain jack means they don't need a tank swap. We were just doing anything to not tank swap back then. But even with those few small things, which they do again address in the Savage difficulty, it was a really good fight, and still to this day I think holds up really well if you ever do like a low item level challenge. So there's some ideas here that could definitely work for the modern day. And then we get to nail Deus Darnus, which is honestly one of Final Fantasy XIV's most infamous fights. A lot of people think of like Gordius and maybe like Brute Justice, but Nail's kind of like the OG of infamous fights. It has a lot of weird fight design that I don't think holds up super well today, but it's still a pretty iconic fight. So basically, most of its phases kind of just introduce all new mechanics, and then some mechanics come back in certain phases and they don't come back in other phases. So it's like a mix of second Coils, like less engaging parts of its design, and also some of its like, you know, some of the better ideas that I was suggesting. It's this like weird hybrid between the two that still makes for a really fun and engaging encounter at the end of the day. Phase 1 is all about setting up meteors and learning a few basic moves from the boss that will show up again later. Tank Buster that explodes, which actually, I take that back, that only happens in this phase. Don't know why they do away with that in the later phases, but they do. Also jumps away and does like AoEs on a bunch of people. Also does a thing where it jumps to a random player and they have to be separated from everyone else. If you've done UCOB, you probably recognize a lot of the skills, and this first phase is introducing them in like a really tame way. And it's really just a teaching phase. Most people made it through this phase in no time at all. It's really just about setting up meteors around the arena that you're going to be using for the second phase, which begins at 65%. That's when the boss leaves and then starts an ad phase. You have to kill a bunch of ads and make sure that all the meteors get eaten in the process. 3 players drop meteors, and then those 3 meteors spawn golems. The green golem is a tank golem, does a lot of tank damage, does a cleave, does a single target tank buster. Very, very painful. There's a blue golem that needs to be interrupted to stop a raid wide, and then also pulls nearby meteors, players, and even other golems in if they're too close. And then a red golem that does like a cascading, AoE, 270 degree AoE, and shoots danger puddles at players, which will kill them if it hits them. Really basic ads, nothing too fancy about them, but they do have a couple of other things. All 3 golems can eat the meteors, so you need to deliberately feed them meteors. And as they eat them, they'll actually get buffs. They'll get like a damage buff or a haste buff, depending on which meteor they eat. And if they eat 4 meteors, they become a giant super golem that is basically the enrage. On top of that, if the golems are too close to each other, they'll merge and form the super golem as well. So you have to keep them somewhat separated. And with 3 golems and only 2 tanks, obviously that becomes a bit of an ordeal. Most people will, designate one specific golem that maybe a healer that's AoE healing can tank, or a DPS can just focus down on their own. But the big thing is the golems switch places. So if the green golem swaps to the one that's hitting the DPS and it's not dead in time, then that becomes a problem all in of itself. Some people would choose to zerg down the green one before the swap happens. Some would choose to hit the DPS's golem and not kill it. And then if the green swaps to it, then you instantly kill it, and now the green golem is completely gone. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to handle it, but it is a really basic ad phase where you just have to make sure you actually feed them all the meteors before they die. Then you get a second set of meteors, which most people would just Mario Kart around the room, and a second set of golems that works the same way, except now you have 6 guaranteed meteors instead of, so you could have as little as like 2 or 3 meteors from the first phase left over for the first set of golems. Most of the time in week 1, it was 4 or 5 meteors, but all the same. Perfectly fine phase. I wouldn't say we've really strayed from doing phases like this. I think this one's a little more engaging than the average ad phase, but at the same time, it's kind of just standard, in my opinion. Then you have phase 3, which is probably the worst phase of the fight and the most exploitable, I suppose, if I'm going to use that term again. So the big thing is the Heaven's Fall mechanic, which if you've done UCOB, you know Heaven's Fall. It's the giant pillar that falls through the center, knocks everyone back. And if it hits you and it crushes you, it kills you instantly. If it knocks you into the wall, it kills you instantly. And then it pulses like paralyzed AoEs. Now, in second coil, when you fight Nail, it starts with the easiest pattern and gradually gets harder. So it starts with like just hitting the same side of the arena twice in a row. It just does like basically 2 opposite quadrants. Then it does like alternating pizza slices. And then it does a rotating where it starts like 2 pizza slices start 180 degrees apart and then rotate either clockwise or counterclockwise, and they gradually pick up speed. Because the hardest one is last, most people would skip the hardest one. Even in week 1, even in like the earliest clears, it was generally considered standard that you would skip Heaven's Fall 3 because this phase is only 68% to 47. It's such a weird number. But yeah, that was kind of like another problem here where like the hardest part of the fight was easy to skip. Again, it's not a new problem. It's a problem that's existed in Final Fantasy XIV for a long time. And their solution to it is pretty funny when we get into talking about the Savage difficulty. The only other thing that really happens here is the Garrote debuff. The boss puts Garrote on players, which gradually gives them stacks of, they give them Garrote Twist, which gives them stacks of Garrote. And at 9 stacks of Garrote, you just instantly die. And then there's also a big ad that hits the tank really hard, shoots fireballs that leave puddles behind at them, and when it's about to die, tethers 2 players and also gives them stacks of Garrote. And then if you don't kill it in time, then that cast, Binding Chain, will instantly kill the 2 chain players. So it's like a mini DPS check / cooldown check for the tanks. When it dies, it drops puddles, and those puddles can cleanse any debuff, including Garrote Twist. So any player who has Garrote Twist just gets one of those puddles, and any of the Garrote players that were chained from the ad can then also grab them after that first player gets them. You get like 2 ads, 2 Garrote Twists. It's like really easy. I think you actually get 3 Garrote Twists because a second Garrote Twist comes out right after the first ad dies, which you can then cleanse with the first ad's puddles. nothing fancy here. Like I said, not a very important phase, not a very memorable phase, and a very abusable phase. They do rework this phase, sort of, when they go into the Unending Coil of Bahamut. Because in the Unending Coil of Bahamut, you just get players who are given dooms, and then there's a light puddle that spawns. That's basically the inspiration, is the same idea, but that puts more onus on you to be quick about it, because it's a doom debuff now, which just instantly kills you. And also the player baits determine where the spots are, and they all have different timers on the doom, so you need to know who's cleansing first, second, or first, second, and third. So they iterate on it and improve on it in Unending Coil, in my opinion. So that's really the biggest takeaway, is that this is the inspiration for that mechanic in particular. But there's also, like, no chariots, no dynamos, no jumping. The boss doesn't really do anything here. It's all about the Heavens Falls and all about the ads. And even the Raven's Beak Tank Buster, the one that leaves the explosion behind from phase 1, is gone at this point and never comes back. So it's just a really strange phase that just basically eliminates everything you learned from the previous phases here. Doesn't matter at all, which doesn't make sense because the boss is back and they could have done a whole lot more with this. But the main reason is because the final phase, which begins at that 47%, takes all the phase 1 mechanics. It takes the jumping away and doing the meteor streams on all the players with the spread. It takes the, is that it? It takes Chariot and Dynamo. I guess there's no meteors in this phase. That Raven's Beak still isn't there. And then it adds the dragons around the arena that have the Fire and Ice debuff that you also probably remember from UCOB. And then also has the Thunderstruck debuff, which is just a player that needs to get away from the group. But it's only one of them here. So yeah, Unending Coil is a lot closer to like the Savage version of this fight. But the Savage version of this fight is just very similar, just kind of amped up. And again, we'll talk about that later. But it's really all about managing the dive bombs and managing the Fire and Ice debuff for the last like half of the boss's health, while making sure to spread during the dive bombs. There's also a dynamo that happens during dive bombs. That's actually one of the more toxic things that happens, because there's not really like a good place to hold the boss during that, where someone at the wall can get into the middle of the room. So that was often the biggest problem of the phase. The boss also does get a ramping damage buff the longer the phase goes on. Every time it does a rotation of its mechanics, it uses Bahamut's favor, and that gives her a stacking buff. And so there is like a soft enrage part on top of the hard enrage part, but the hard enrage was almost never a factor back in the day, and the soft enrage bit is barely noticeable here either, so it's just not really something people remember it for. It's obviously iconic enough of a phase that when they did Unending Coil, this was the phase they focused on. The dragons, the dive bombs, the baits, the dynamos, the chariots, the jumping to a random player. I mean, it all ends up, when it's put together and kind of sped up a little bit, it makes a really good and interesting fight. Another thing here is that silly quote thing from Unending Coil is not a thing here at all. That whole, like, oh, you know, whatever, looking for the word blazing or soaring or... all of that doesn't exist here. So I still don't know like what the point was of doing that and why they were so hard committed when they said it was like, it was part of the original fight. Nobody I know did that here. Like, maybe the boss has quotes with those things, but it was nobody I know back then ever was like, oh yeah, I gotta read the boss's quotes to make sure I know the mechanic is coming. So that was a really weird thing they did in Unending Coil that was, you know, moved on from this. But it's a cool phase. It's good that it's like 50% of the boss's health, but the boss also doesn't have that much health because there's an ad phase, there's an extra ad in the previous phase, and like all the other fights, they just didn't give bosses a lot of health back in the day. The Avatar kind of has the most. I think he was the first boss that had over 1 million health, and that was a lot because like the other bosses were at like 400,000 or 500,000 on top of their ads. So it's really noticeable when a boss had 1 million health as opposed to that. I think it was the only boss that anyone ever really enraged on at any point. And that was also very short-lived of an experience. So yeah, this is another fight where I think they've already learned lessons, and I think that they understand that modern design, this type of fight can keep up with modern design, and it's kind of special in its own right. So instead of pulling things from it, it's kind of important to see turn 9 for what it is and only take parts of it piecemeal when it makes sense. Things like DSR effectively having a mini UCOB nail phase where it has the Thunderstruck and it has, you know, the baits from the dragons, the liquid hells. Like it borrows a lot of elements from that fight. I think they understand that this is one that just, they can't just say, oh, let's do that again, unless they're literally copying this and doing another dragon phase. I'm glad they understand that because it's so unique of a final phase. And it really is an identifying factor of the fight, to the point where it's just not about lessons learned here. It's about just looking at it and being like, yes, that is how it was, and that is how it will be, and it will stand out for that for the test of time. Now, the whole video I've been alluding to talking about Savage, but I want to talk about Savage only in the regard that this is the worst iteration of it, in any case. So the normal mode was Savage difficulty back then. So Savage here is more like Ultimate, as I said at the start of the video. But all they really did for Savage was fix all of the cheese strats that people came up with. All the exploits are fixed. And they like doubled or tripled or quadrupled every other mechanic that's happening. So looking at Rafflesia, the boss now eats in a 360-degree cone around it, so that line of sight strategy no longer works. The bulbs aren't really like something you can take your time to stop and kill anymore. So, and they tether to the boss, so the boss can't really be near them, or it starts like murdering people and becoming unkillable. So you end up actually needing to drag the boss around the room and try to reposition with the tank, and then do the mechanics relative to the space that you actually have available. And that forces a much more engaging design. They also fix a lot of the boss HP problems where, you know, a boss, you know, this, I mentioned Rafflesia, people just skip the last 40% of the fight. So they make the final phase begin at 60% and put far more strict requirements on like how much DPS you actually need to get all of this done, because it was, especially for the time, like way more item level relevant. So you had to do the slug mechanic with the slime mechanic. You had to do the baits, but it's otherwise almost the exact same phase. Like it still has basically all the exact same mechanics. Swarm also, I think, heavied people in the Savage mode, which it didn't do in the normal, which meant that you really had to like plan your swarms and like design set spots for it. But it was really just, for Rafflesia, just getting you to do the fight properly, because the Honey Glaze thing still works the same. Blighted Bouquet works the same. I'd say you really just start the fight in phase 2 and then go to phase 3, and phase 1 just kind of doesn't exist. For Melusine, the Renauds can't be repetrified, and they start enraging. They start sprinting at players pretty quickly. I don't think they could be heavied either in this case. So actually, they could definitely be bound, but I don't think you could heavy, because I remember Summoner could double heavy with, I think, Miasma and one other, and like an actual other heavy skill. Maybe it was a cross-class skill. But they could straight up like bind an enemy by double heavying them, and I know that they fixed that in the Savage as well. So maybe they just made it so that they can't be, yeah, I think they made it so they can't be heavied, but they can be bound, which is really important. But other than that, Melusine is still annoying. You still have really bad phase pushes. If anything, they're worse in Savage, because if you are off by even a little bit, the timing of the fight is absolutely screwed. All the ads hit way harder. Everything has more health. There's and then later there's like 2 Venomous Tails and then 4 Venomous Tails that need to be assumed super quickly. And then there's 2 Curse Shrieks and 2 Renauds spawning at the... Yeah, that's really all they did. They did the same thing with the Avatar. It's the ballistic missiles knock people away. There's like 1 more tower, so it's up to 4 towers now instead of up to 3 towers. There's 2 tethers. There's 2 Allegan fields. Like, again, it's just really uninspired, uninteresting design. Funnily enough, turn 9 is probably the best aging of them all. I think turn 8, while uninspired, actually makes the fight one of the best fights the game's ever had. I think turn 8 is like, it's lame how they do it, but it really just makes the already good Avatar fight now no longer exploitable, and thus amazing across the board. Even though it does have weird percentage-based pushes where you can like skip different tower sets, you still have to fundamentally be able to do it, and do it very quickly, and priority system and survive. So it's really, really demanding of the player. But then you get to turn 9, and the difference is, because it's not really an exploitable fight other than the skipping of the 3rd Heaven's Fall, it just kind of like is like the normal plus. Like turn 6 and turn 9 are kind of both that way. They're just normal plus, because they're just making you do the fights almost entirely in like a way that has a bit more stricter movement, a bit more stricter management of the resources. There's more meteors. The Mario Kart strat for the meteors doesn't really work anymore. There's more of them as well. So the way that the golems are managed is a decent bit stricter. The Heaven's Fall phase starts with the most difficult Heaven's Fall, and also adds these like proximity bait meteors that you have to like, well, not even proximity. They're baited like the phase 1 meteors, but they go away immediately. So you don't have to worry about them like overlapping with each other or, them being fed. You're basically just trying to bait them and run while doing the Heavens Fall mechanic, which actually does work really well, in my opinion. So that's a nice little addition in there. And then, the ad is a little, hits harder, is a lot more strict with the Garotes and the Garote twists and whatnot. And you just, the phase lasts longer. So you end up doing most of the Heavens Falls, and they start with the hardest one anyway. And then the last phase is literally, I'm almost certain that the last phase is literally the UCOB phase. I think the biggest difference with the UCOB one, those meteors that drop down during Heavens Fall also drop down during the last phase of turn 9. So there's a little bit stricter movement there. And B, I don't think I'd have to go back and look at footage, but as I'm recording this, I'm kind of doing it from memory. I don't think there's 5 dragons in Savage. I think there's still only 3 dragons like there is in normal, and their rules are much easier to understand in the Savage. So even if there is 5, I mean, ultimately it's almost exactly identical to UCOB, but actually with a few additional things. If anything, the UCOB version, while it's a bit like, the whole text reading thing, there are parts of it that are technically harder. It's also in some ways not as hard as Second Coil Savage, just because there's a lot more onus on how long you have to do it correct and the amount and the type of movement that you need. There's a few more like stricter things about it, but the double thunderstrucks, the fire ice thing, the dive bombs, it's all still there. So the Savage modes here aren't really that interesting. And I think they learned that pretty quick, that normal and Savage, you can't do normal as like a normal raid difficulty and Savage as like 4 individual ultimates. They ran into issues with the rewards where nobody really cared about the rewards. It was 4 different titles. It would still count as your like weekly clear for the lockout on patch. So if you beat the Savage mode for the week, then it would loot lock you for normal, but it had the exact same loot. So it was like, why would you do Savage more than the once to clear it, or maybe to like help a friend or something? It was a purely status related thing, and the only gain of it was the title. Also, you could just unsync Savage nowadays and get all the titles for Second Coil. They never like item level locked it or anything like that. So they understood that the prestige from that was so kind of like not relevant that they just didn't really want to preserve it like they do Ultimates either. And while, yeah, to a hardcore raiders, it sounds great. Oh, we get normal and like Savage is normal, and then we get an ultimate of every fight. The engagement rate was so low, and even amongst statics that were able to like clear normal and do normal, it had an even lower adoption rate. Like it was just, that was the biggest lesson taken away, is that they just can't do something like that. That it's worth more to put the effort into an ultimate encounter than it is to add another difficulty to the existing raid tier. So that's when they committed to the idea of normal being the for everyone, which was also a piece of feedback, because if you wanted to do the Binding Coil story, you effectively had to be a Savage raider. In some regards, it worked out. A lot of people who would have maybe never considered doing Savage got into the Binding Coil raids just for the story. And then they got a harsh wake up when Gordius came around, which we'll talk about later. But it did have that benefit of kind of forcing people to consider being endgame raiders just to actually experience the story. Majority of feedback was don't do that, and that would eventually be something they did later. So this entire like hard and harder would eventually become story mode and actual raid mode. And I think that's a proper lesson learned in this case. I wouldn't want like a 3rd or a 4th difficulty for fights I've already done and am doing weekly, and then I don't want to get into talking. I'm talking about WoW stuff with like heroic, mythical. We're not going to get into that right now. But overall, Second Coil kind of doesn't have a whole lot of design decisions that make sense, because the fights themselves were all conceptually well done, but none of them featured things that were like stand out. They never do them again, except like Brainjack. They're just ideas that they could absolutely do again, that have aged well conceptually, and just a matter of not like wanting to copy paste old fights at this point. And even if they do, they would have to make sure that they don't get exploited like they did. So Second Coil just in a really weird place when you actually look at it objectively, comparatively to First Coil, where we constantly were pointing out things that First Coil did that'd be like, wow, it'd be really cool if they did that again, because they don't really do that anymore. We've already kind of jumped ahead in terms of design in such a way that we can't say that much about Second Coil. And when they have, they did, because we got Unending Coil and we've seen UCOB stuff show up, and like it's already happened. So before I beat the point home anymore, overall Second Coil, iconic, but also not much to pull from. Just a really interesting series of mistakes, I suppose, that then had to be fixed in a not-so-popular follow-up with the Savage difficulty. But that's going to be a wrap for my Raid Retro on the second Coils of Bahamut. Be sure to like and subscribe, and in the next video, we'll be looking at the final Coils of Bahamut, which I'm actually really excited to talk about, because I already know there are a bunch of ideas there that we have not seen again, or we've seen small variations of, and we can actually point back to the inspirations for a lot of those things there. So, can't wait to talk about it. But like I said, like, subscribe, comment for engagement, and I will see all of you in the next video. Until then, take care.